Okay, everybody, thank you for being here today. Uh, my name is John Sayre, and I'm the Associate Director of Academic Advising at the College of Charleston in Charleston, South Carolina, and I'm a member of the SAL Professional Learning and Development Committee. On behalf of the committee, I want to thank you for participating in today's structured conversation. Today's conversation features a professional learning opportunity for SAL members, colleagues, and all of our attendees. The SAL and the Professional Learning and Development Committee are committed to involving, featuring, and representing diverse perspectives and identities in our offerings to meet your professional development needs. You can help us achieve this goal by submitting a structured conversation proposal of your own. And more information can be found on the SAL Structured Conversation website, which we will add into the chat. During this presentation, we will be recording, and we also invite you to participate with questions, comments, and feedback through the chat function, which we will be monitoring as we progress. To get us started with today's conversation, we'd like to invite all of our attendees to please chat your name and title and institution into the chat so we know who's with us here today. So let's get started by welcoming our presenter today, Rachel Siefring from Virginia Commonwealth University. Rachel serves as the assessment specialist for the Division of Student Affairs at VCU. She's served in that role since 2021, where she has worked to build a culture of assessment in both the division and unit levels, and seeks to demonstrate meaningful ways that student affairs practitioners can use assessment and research in their work. She holds a master's degree in educational psychology from the University of Virginia and a bachelor's degree in bioinformatics from VCU. Sense of belonging continues to be a critical topic for student affairs practitioners, particularly as it relates to students' persistence at the university. In today's conversation, Rachel will discuss recent findings from one college campus that looked at how students' level of extroversion and their involvement on campus contributed to their sense of belonging. And without further ado, I turn it over to Rachel for a wonderful conversation today. Thank you for being here.
Hey everybody, give me 1 second. Let me share my screen. Okay. Can you all see it? Are we good? Perfect. Okay. It's so great to see you all. I'm so glad you all are here. I am gonna, as they said, I'm gonna talk about adding personality into the mix. So we're gonna be talking about the influence of extroversion and involvement on student sense of belonging. And let's see, here we go. Here's like a really rough agenda or roadmap of where we're going to go today. So I'm going to give a pretty brief introduction on why we're going to talk about this, do a really brief literature review, or kind of give you an overview of what current research is saying. And then I'll dive into the study that we did at VCU. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to start with is, why should we even talk about like extroversion? Like, why does it matter? Is it even important? Obviously, all of you are on this call and you think it's important to some degree. So this was kind of an aha moment for me, working in student affairs assessment. I was looking over some open-ended feedback we had from our new student survey about a year ago. And there are a couple of student quotes that really stood out to me. So we ask this survey about a month into the semester, into the fall semester, and we're trying to get a feel for how students are acclimating to the campus and building relationships. So this one student said, I just wish that the event, probably a large scale event, I wish the event had more things for people who are introverted and struggle in a social environment. And then another student, they had some really great insights. They were very thoughtful in this response. They just said, I'm just less social than most people. And so going to weeks of welcome or our big initial campus-wide programming, that's really overwhelming and it's just not very appealing. And so I wouldn't recommend it to anybody like me. So if more events were made that were one-on-one in approach or small group, it'd be easier for me to recommend this to somebody like me. So this kind of got me thinking. I was just thinking through like what existing data do we have related to this, and then like what's out there in the literature. So this kind of led to two main questions. So first question was, is students' level of extroversion, so how extroverted a student is this connected with their sense of belonging? And then another big question is, and we ask this a lot in student affairs, is students' level of involvement on campus, is this associated with their sense of belonging? So just like thinking, keeping those questions in the back of my mind. So this kind of directed my literature review, just seeing what prior research is out there on these different constructs. So let's just start with sense of belonging. We talk about sense of belonging a lot in student affairs, and rightly so. Like it's very important. It's very connected to students' retention and persistence at the university. And because we're in student affairs, we're talking a lot about how campus involvement connects to sense of belonging. If hypothetically, if we're doing our programming right, we are hoping that if students are more involved on campus, they'll have higher belonging. So here's just a couple of articles that I came across. They're a little bit more recent, and I think there's probably a little bit more out there, but two articles, and Zoc in 2019, they just found more engagement with peers and outside of the classroom indicated more connection with the university. And then Knife's End from 2020, they found that students who were engaged 10 or more hours per week outside the classroom had higher rates of belonging. So we're kind of hoping this is a positive relationship here. Then I was just really interested in how extroversion impacts campus involvement. So I guess the thought here is, if you're more extroverted, are you more likely to get involved? Does that look a little bit different for you if you're not as extroverted? So here there's not much out here connecting these two big constructs, but these two dissertation studies on the screen were very helpful. So Toma in 2015, she was really interested in, she did a qualitative study and looked at how introverts and extroverts sought out different involvement opportunities on campus, and kind of looked at how they experienced involvement in different ways. And then Whitfley in 2022, she was really interested in the introvert experience, and she conducted interviews with introverts across multiple colleges and universities. So we really don't know what this relationship looks like. Extroversion probably does affect campus involvement. So how extroverted a student is probably does make a little bit of an impact on students' involvement. And then finally, I was interested in how your extroversion, so how extroverted a student is, how that impacts your belonging. And there's a little bit more out there on this. So Malone 2012, they found a moderate positive association between extroversion and belonging. Harris in 2017, they found that first-year students who were more extroverted reported higher social engagement and belonging their second and fourth years. And then this last one is hot off the press, was just published last month. And Stubblebine and colleagues, they just found that extroversion was positively associated with belonging. And this relationship was stronger within the context of larger universities, which was really interesting. So that's kind of our triad here. We have three different main things. Sense of belonging is our big outcome that we're aiming for. And just thinking about the relationships of those three. So now I'm going to talk about what we did at VCU. Those questions that I brought up earlier, how our extroversion and how our involvement connected with belonging, those guided the conversation for me. So Before I dive into what our study was, just a little bit of context about VCU. The context did play a little bit. It played out in the findings, which was really interesting. But VCU, just overall across the board, we're an urban campus, public four-year university. Our total enrollment is 29,000. We are an R1, and recently we reached like the top 50 from the National Science Foundation for research expenditures. About 3/4 of our student body is undergraduate, followed by 15% being graduate and 10% being first professional. And then just across the board, these are just VCU overall demographics. For gender, we're about 64% female, 35% male, about 1% other. And then underrepresented minority, so anybody who is Indigenous, Black, African American, Hispanic, any of those categories. If you're not exclusively white, not exclusively Asian, and not white and Asian, you're in this group. So we have about 33% of students who would be considered URM. 24% are first gen, and then about a third are Pell Grant recipients. So that's just context about VCU, just stuff to keep in mind. Here were the broader research questions that I ended up with, and then I'm going to dive into the study that we did. So the main research question that I had was, is students' level of extroversion, so how extroverted they are, and their level of involvement on campus, is this associated with their sense of belonging, and specifically their relational and social belonging? And I'll define that in a second. And then a couple of sub-questions. So first sub-question was, are involved students, are they self-reporting higher extroversion? So is there a difference in, are involved students just more extroverted? Main question there. And then second sub-question, are involved students self-reporting higher sense of belonging? So here's a little bit about our study design and sample. This study is a little bit dated, but some of this data was just sitting on the shelf and needed to be used. So we conducted this in fall of 2021. So we were looking specifically, just wanted a baseline understanding of involvement on campus, how students were involved in campus activities and student organizations. We conducted a random sample. We had 5,000 undergrads and 2,000 graduate professional students who were invited. And we got back a total of 688 responses. And that's about a 10% response rate, which isn't terrible. So it's decent. And about 67% of those were undergraduate, 31% were graduate or professional. The model, the stats model that I'm going to show you all today, that has a total of 389 complete observations. There's some reasons for that. The demographics questions and extroversion questions were right at the end of the survey, so not everybody got to those. Here's just a little bit of background on the students who responded. So we had about, as far as those who responded, we had about 70% female, 26% male, and then 4% non-binary, trans, genderqueer, gender non-conforming. About 38% were underrepresented minority, 23% were first gen. And then we asked about their working status as well. So 39% are not working at all. 35% are working off campus only. And then 25% are working on campus exclusively or are working on campus and off campus. Trying to get a student employment indicator there. And then housing situation, about 20% are living on, we're living on campus, and 80% we're living off campus. So the key predictors here, this will probably be helpful for y'all to think about. So the first main predictor was extroversion. Okay, and we used a standardized scale. There's lots of great scales out there for personality. We used the Mini International Personality Item Pool. specifically the extroversion subscale, and it has those 4 questions you see on the screen. I am the life of the party. I don't talk a lot. I talk to a lot of different people at parties, and I keep in the background. Okay, so students are handed those and they're asked to rate how accurate those statements are about them. And that's used to calculate an extroversion score for them. So the final score will range from -10 to +10. And what was really interesting was that extroversion, when you charted it, was normally distributed. So essentially, we didn't have most students were either not super extroverted and they weren't super low on extroversion. They were like, most of them were right in the middle, average level of extroversion. And then additionally, campus involvement, I kind of recoded that as whether or not they were involved or not involved. And so those 3 categories you see on the screen, those were what constituted anybody who was considered involved. So if they attended an activity or an event, if they were part of a group or an organization of some kind, or if they did both of those activities, they were considered involved. About 56% of our student body, of our students who responded, were involved. And then finally, sense of belonging. So this is, there's multiple ways to define or different characteristics of belonging. Our office has like 4 different subscales for it, and I just chose to focus on the subscale that related to belonging in peer relationships and support. And those 3 questions we ask are on the screen. So I have developed personal relationships with other students. Someone at VCU cares about my success. I have found a social circle at VCU where I truly fit in. Students are asked those questions and whether or not they agree with those statements. So this particular average score for this one was a little bit high. So it was 4.5 on a 6-point scale, which is good news, like overall. But yeah, just a heads up. All right, so turning back to the research questions, there's that primary research question: is their level of involvement and their level of extroversion, is that associated with relational and social sense of belonging? And then the 2 sub-questions. So the first one, are students self-reporting higher extroversion? The answer to that is no. I ran a t-test, looked at differences between students, extroversion, average extroversion for involved and not involved, and there's no difference, which is actually really great news. If that was higher, like more extrovert, if the involved group was more extroverted, I'd be a little bit concerned. And then the second question, are involved students self-reporting higher sense of belonging? That one is a yes. So students who are involved, I'll show you this chart. Students who are involved have a higher sense of belonging in relationships and social support, which is not, it shouldn't be super surprising. I also will just point out, this is not a super massive difference between involved and not involved. When I presented this at IUPI, someone brought that up. They're like, that's really not big. And I was like, yeah, it's really not. I'm not sure what's going on here. But it is like half a point of a difference in their sense of belonging score. So after running those just comparative analyses, I wanted to see if I ran an ordinary least squares multiple regression model with sense of belonging as the outcome. And so main outcome, sense of belonging in social and relational support. I controlled for these covariates that you see on the screen. So I controlled for gender, underrepresented minority status, first gen, working status, student level. So if they were undergraduate versus graduate or professional, and then their housing situation, whether they lived on or off campus. And then I added in my predictors at steps 2 and 3. So their extroversion score and then campus involvement, if they were involved or not involved. And so here's kind of, I'll show this in a graphical format in a second, but here's essentially what I found. Students underrepresented minority status, this finding was really interesting. If controlling for everything else on the screen, if a student was an underrepresented minority, they had a little bit of a boost in their sense of belonging by like a quarter of a belonging point. That one was really interesting, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. As far as extroversion was very positively and significantly associated with belonging. And that number, like 0.07 of a point, that looks really small until you think about the gap between those who are really low on extroversion and really high on extroversion. That can be a pretty big difference. And then campus involvement, if you were involved, you had like half a point higher on belonging. And then just finally, the model, if you all are stats people, the model explains about 10% of the variance in sense of belonging, which is not like, wow, amazing, but it's still like worth considering. So here's another way to look at or think about what was on that last slide. So these are predictions for our students who are not involved. So as you all can see, on the x-axis, we've got our extroversion scale or our score, so -10 to +10. And then on the y, we've got our sense of belonging score. So it's pretty obvious, as the more extroverted you are, the higher your sense of belonging is predicted to be. And this relationship is higher for students of underrepresented minorities. That's essentially what that's saying here. So students who are not involved and rate themselves higher on extroversion are also rating themselves higher on belonging in peer relationships and support. So that was not involved. When we add in involvement, everybody gets a boost. It's not huge, but they do get a boost. So students who are involved and rate themselves higher on extroversion, same pattern, they're rating themselves higher on belonging in peer relationships and support. So just a few considerations, and I'm still thinking through this, and I would love to hear everybody's thoughts about all of this. One thought is kind of going back to those initial quotes that I showed at the beginning, just thinking about our campus activity and event design. Specifically for our large scale events and programming that happen at the beginning of the semester or throughout the school year, those might draw a more extroverted crowd. And so are there ways we can reach students who are just more introverted and need a little bit of extra help or have like social anxiety? Can we make some adjustments in order for them to make friends? Another thought is, and this is very specific to VCU and the finding around underrepresented minority students having higher sense of belonging. I'm just really curious, like, are our campus activities and events, are they just drawing more of those students in particular? Are there just specific things that they are leaning towards, or are our activities and events more catered towards them, which is really great. I'm really surprised that we found that, but it is definitely unusual. Another thing to think about is just how sense of belonging was measured. So I only looked at belonging in peer relationships and support, but there's other pieces of belonging. So university affiliation, or just general belonging with the university. I didn't include that in this. And then again, there's just those institution level factors. So specifically thinking about URM status and how that is maybe fostered a little bit by the institution at large. It's just something to consider. And then finally, this is kind of relating to campus activity or event design. But I'm really curious for our staff who are running programming are developing programming and implementing it, what is their level of extroversion? You usually have to be pretty extroverted to do all of those things, which is really great. But I guess kind of asking them, not quite an implicit bias test, but asking them like where they are on the scale, and just to think about that as they are developing and planning events. And then here's just some random resources before I turn it over to questions. I haven't actually read this book, but I've heard really great things. So Quiet by Susan Cain. I've heard really awesome things. She kind of brings a bunch of different items to light about just how introverts have to kind of face a lot of face the extroverted world, where it's very focused on being extroverted. And then these two dissertation studies, they're obviously very long, but they're very interesting. So if you're interested in learning more about how extroversion could really connect to campus involvement, these are really great resources. These are all of the references if you're interested. And then I'm just open for questions or comments. I'm really curious to know what this is looking like for you all, if you all have done similar things.
Thank you, Rachel. That is a lot of fascinating research. I'd like to invite our guests to post into the chat any questions or comments or anything you'd like to discuss in any more detail. Rachel, I'll go ahead and kick it off. I'm just I'm curious if in the course of your research and deciphering extroversion versus introversion and involvement and belonging. Did you find any instances where where the research referred to tied belonging directly to persistence at the institution or graduation rates or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was actually reading a few papers about that this past weekend. Yes, I think some people, I just want to make sure I'm phrasing this right. A sense of belonging is usually, there's a lot of, I'll back up, there's a lot connecting involvement on campus to like retention and persistence. If you're more engaged, you're more likely to stay. But then there's other research that's kind of using sense of belonging as like an intermediate outcome. So involvement predicting sense of belonging, kind of, if you have higher sense of belonging, you're more likely to be retained. And then there's other factors that could play in there, like mental health status and that kind of thing. I don't know if that answers your question, but there is some.
Yes, good. Thank you. Thank you. Let's see, I think Ashley was asking about the source of your sense of belonging scale.
Okay. So our scale was developed internally, actually before I started working in my current position. So we had like a graduate assistant, and she was really focused on belonging, and she kind of helped develop the scale. So we had a really long list of like measures and subscales, and that's been pared down. We did some like exploratory factor analysis and looked at that. Yeah, so it was internally developed, and it's got those four main pieces. So general belonging, I belong at VCU, university affiliation, do you like wearing the school colors, belonging with faculty and staff, so I feel like supported in the classroom, and then what I just shared, so belonging in peer relationships.
Great. We had a question from Amanda. Was your sample a stratified random sample across the subgroups that you identified?
No, so that was just a straight, simple random sample. That's a good question. Yeah, I would love to do a stratified random sample at some point, but we just haven't gotten to it.
Yeah. Great. Does anyone else want to ask Rachel a question about her research? So, Rachel, if you would indulge me, could we go back a couple of slides? I would love to look again at the graph that showed the yes,
That one.
precisely. Um, Students who are involved at the rate. Right, and then the the previous or the lower two stratifications there, those are the students that did identify as
Those are sorry, that's a great question. So the two bottom ones are the ones who are not involved.
the not involved.
Yeah.
Okay,
So this is
interesting.
yeah, parsing it out by involvement. So this is not involved. And then I gray it out. And then we add those who are involved.
Yeah,
So
right,
same
got it,
groups,
got it.
they've just got the involvement piece added on
Great,
there. Yeah.
fascinating. All
So
right. Now, I think in some of your summary comments, you were discussing future steps as a result of what you've learned. And you're continuing to ask some of those questions about programming and how exactly. So I wonder if you could speak to, since you've wrapped this part up, have there been any tangible outcomes or new concepts in programming that you've attempted?
that's a great question. We've definitely presented like high level findings to some of our programming staff. So I think last year we presented to our weeks of welcome committee, but honestly, we're only this particular piece, like about social anxiety, that's
Mm,
like that's one line in a presentation. So I wouldn't say it was heavily emphasized. This is always the struggle when you're an assessment professional, you kind of exhorting or encouraging the practitioners in the room to like look at something a different way or try something new, or have you considered this, or this is the feedback we got. So I think we definitely
No,
expected it, but yeah, I haven't seen any tangible outcomes yet, but
okay. All right. Well, that's certainly, obviously, that's a goal for anyone I, I'm sure you'd agree in student affairs, we want to take our research and make it into something the students can feel and experience. And if anybody here, including you, Rachel, figures out how to get introverted students more involved, I know I'd love to hear more about that.
yeah, I would too.
Um, Ashley had a follow-up. She asked if you could share again about how you defined involved versus not involved.
That's a great question. I don't, let me go back a little bit. So involved it's almost there. There you go. So not involved means they did not attend any events, they did not attend any activities, and that they are not involved in any student groups or organizations on campus. So they're not involved in anything at all. They haven't gone to anything. Involved, I was really broad with the term involved. I don't necessarily agree with this, but I was just curious if this would make a difference. So you are an involved student if you attended one event or activity. You're an involved student if you're part of a group or a club or an organization of some kind, or if you're doing both of those things. That would be involvement, or at least that's how I defined it for this particular study.
Ashley, does that give you the feedback you were looking for?
That's helpful. We similarly at Mizzou look at involved and not involved, but over the past few years, we've added another layer of highly involved and involved, and it's been helpful there's even more differentiation in the outcomes when you do that. And so our highly involved are students who are involved in, they're actively participating, or they hold a leadership position, and they're in one or more student orgs. And then the other students who don't fit that criteria are just involved. And then we have the not involved. And it's interesting because like the sense of belonging, the retention, And some other outcomes that we measure look different for those two groups. But we haven't considered extroversion and introversion. So this is really interesting because we're really trying to think thoughtfully about our non-involved students and how we can kind of make, find creative ways to engage them. Not saying that they're all introverts, but you know, it's another tool. So thank you, Rachel, for sharing your research.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. Marley was asking how does campus involvement include student work on your campus?
Not how I included it in the model. So I did not include student employment in that involvement factor. That's a really great question. I did, however, include it as a covariate. So their working status was in there if they were working on campus. But no, it wasn't technically included in as an involvement characteristic. But yeah, that's something to consider.
Joseph had a comment and a question. He said that being familiar with the research that suggests student involvement is associated with persistence, he has often wondered if involvement and persistence were both outcomes of another factor, like introversion. How would you, Rachel, summarize how this study might speak to that?
Yeah. I'm looking at that question. Give me 1 second. So I would say well, I think if we're kind of thinking about sense of belonging as like a intermediate stopping point or connector to persistence, then it would essentially say if you're more extroverted, you know, your sense of belonging is higher and it's possible that you might persist a little bit better at the university. And then involvement is also playing a role there. But I wasn't, I was hoping, this was my dream, I was hoping to do a path analysis with this where, you know, we have involvement and extroversion as the mediator on belonging as the outcome. And I just couldn't get to that. But so kind of what you're getting at, I think it's Joseph. It would be good to have like kind of, because you are kind of it's like asking about a path analysis, it looks like. Yeah,
And
I don't think
yeah,
that answered your question.
Joseph makes the follow-up comment that the one underlining concern for him and his colleagues is that their efforts to get introverts involved could be counterproductive. And so I would put that to the group if they have any thoughts about that specifically, that the outreach to introverts might actually deter involvement, or create a greater sense of isolation that could diminish belonging. We would hope not diminish persistence. But if there's anyone else that wants to speak to that, please let's add to the comments here. We have another question from Donna, and she asked, do you have any insights on student involvement based on activity? If other activities that cater more towards introversion, do you think that would get more introverts involved? So again, continuing that conversation about how this kind of outreach and involvement could impact those students that identify as introverted.
Yeah. That's a really great question. So I think it depends on the kind of activity we're talking about here. If I've been thinking a little bit more about the new student experience. So we ask our new students, like, if you attended an event, did you attend by yourself? And you were more than happy to do so. Did you attend by yourself and you didn't want to be by yourself? Were you with a group of friends? That kind of thing. So I think one piece of feedback we got from that particular survey, which is a different survey than the one I talked about, is that we would have introverts who would come to these huge events and everybody else has come to the event with like their small group of friends or their clique and that kind of thing. And so my supervisor and I were kind of talking through this and like, what are ways, obviously we're not the programmers, so it depends on the programmer and what they have capacity for. But if there's ways to just mix everybody up and do like small group activities, like a mixer type of deal, that's one thought, especially if it's new students and they just want to meet new people and make new friends. But yeah, I don't know. I think we just have to be really creative. One thing I don't know enough about, and I'm sure other people have thoughts about this, is kind of getting at what Joseph was saying, trying to get introverts involved, is that counterproductive? So I guess it just feels like post-COVID and with all of our new Gen Z students, like if sometimes it feels like we literally have to soft serve involvement up to them to get them to come to events and get involved sometimes. At least that's how I feel on my campus because we have a lot of commuter students. So yeah, campus context is a big deal. But I will just point out, it was encouraging to see that students who were involved versus not involved, there was no difference in their extroversion. They were like very similar. Yeah, those are thoughts. I don't know. I would love to hear what other people think too.
I certainly agree with you, Rachel. I think that we're really tapping into something that's pertinent to all student affairs programmers and service providers. We need to we want to address the students' needs as they identify themselves in with particular characteristics that impact their educational experience. Let's see, Amanda's added here. Can you identify the students who were not involved in your study, that is in quotations, not involved in your study, and engage them in a follow-up focus group or engage them in an assessment process overall? Let them design the path. So that's a very interesting suggestion from Amanda. Rachel, would you like to speak to that?
I think that's a really great idea. I will say on the study that I presented on, we asked, all those key involvement questions, and then if they said they weren't involved in anything, we also asked them if they if they planned to get involved or if they did not plan to get involved. And about 20% said they didn't plan to get involved at all. But then there was another 30% of those who were not involved, and they said, I just don't know where to look for information about involvement opportunities. So I guess there's, those folks who are just not going to get involved at all. They might be adult learners or non-traditional students. They just don't have the time or capacity. But then there's that, small group who needs more information or communication about these things. But I really love that idea, Amanda. I think that's a really, really great idea.
Okay. Okay. Megan Bell. Megan Bell, if you're on the call, you got some great comments here. I wonder, Megan, if I could invite you to step in and just summarize your comments there. I don't want to misspeak.
Oh,
Megan?
sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sure.
I can speak, but not be on camera right now.
Why don't you?
Yeah, I was just thinking about maybe not separate events, but efforts to make the showing up at an event or activity feel less overwhelming for folks who aren't as comfortable just, meeting a bunch of new people. So it made me think of at my prior institution, the recreation center had a fitness buddies program where you could sign up and then have a partner to go work out with. So, the working out is the same, the use of the rec center, but it made going in and accessing that that's what students were saying. Like, I just don't want to walk in there and look like I don't know what I'm doing and I don't know anyone. So I wonder if that kind of thing could be applied to some other kinds of events, or activities or joining clubs where you kind of pre-arrange or make a softer entry for people. And that might work. That might benefit all students, even the extrovert ones. So
Yes. Yeah. No, that's a really great idea. Yeah.
Thank you, Megan. That's great. And Marley had another additional comment. Some introverts don't place a high value on involvement, but more just relationships that can occur by way of involvement. So perhaps this is more about promoting relationship development rather than getting students involved. And I think that that's I wouldn't. I don't want to misspeak here, but I feel like maybe that's exactly what Megan was just speaking about. It's more, it may not necessarily be about what they're doing, but rather who they're doing with it and having the opportunity to build a new relationship.
Absolutely. That is what the TOMA 2015 dissertation, that's what she highlights. So you did, that's really good, Marley. She really highlights that extroverts are involved in everything, and they're not really looking at depth of relationship, and the introverts are really looking for depth of relationship. It's really interesting stuff.
And that's a great comment, again, for all of us programmers to take away when dealing with students who identify differently in regards to extroversion and introversion. This has been a wonderful conversation. We're nearing the end of our hour together. Are there more comments or questions that people would like to put to Rachel or to put to the group for discussion? Give it just a moment there. Amanda says, thank you. That's great. All right. So just not hearing any further comments for discussion. Let's go ahead and move to our conclusion. We'd like to thank Rachel Siefring again today of VCU for being here, and the SOL Professional Learning and Development Committee for bringing your research to us for today's conversation. Wonderful context and content here. Our recording of the structured conversation and associated materials, along with the link to provide feedback on today's session, will be shared with you via email and will also be available on our website. So with that in mind, we'll look forward to our next session, March 7th, in which our topic will be AI in assessment. There will be details about that session coming again by email. So, but mark your calendars, Thursday, March 7th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Again, thank you to Rachel for being here. This was a really fascinating conversation, and really just feels like a jumping off point for even a much greater, deeper conversation about involvement of our students. So without any other additional comments or questions, we'll call it a wrap. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Once again, please know, for all of our participants today, you are certainly invited. If you would like to provide us with a structured conversation, we certainly look forward to those proposals. So just know that proposal app is on the Structured Conversation website of SAL. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Have a great day.